Hi, everyone. Welcome. Huge thank you to Nicole for getting us set up here and off on the right foot. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock. I'm the director at the Institute for Science and Policy, a project here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I want to recognize and thank our partners because this series would not be possible without them. So huge thank you to the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School for International Studies and the Environmental Sustainability Initiative, as well as Colorado State University System's new Spur campus and the International Agriculture Program. If you're joining us today, you may realize this is episode 2 in a 3-part virtual series that we've been hosting. We're calling it Everything on the Table, Reimagining Our Global to Local Food Systems. And our last episode we did a few weeks ago, we took a really big picture view of both climate change and how it's in fact impacting our global food production. And today we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. We're going to look at the interconnectedness between climate change and food as it impacts our livelihood, including those who produce our food. Typically just doesn't happen with the amount of time we have. We'll try to address a lot of them in our discussion portion. Okay, so let me introduce our guests today, including top and definitely not least, but our awesome moderator, Colin Hendricks, who is also our partner in this series. He is a professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, as well as serving as a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a senior research advisor at the Center for Climate and Security. He leads the Environment, Food, and Conflict Lab. She was formerly the past director of the Latin America Center. She's an anthropologist who studies the intersections of globalization, illicit markets, migration as it relates to sea level rise influence across the US and Bangladesh. And our third guest today is Atim Otii. She's the director of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for the city of Denver, where she works to promote greater awareness and integration of immigrant and refugee residents in our city. Prior to joining
clean, sustainable energy to power them as we confront the issue of climate mitigation. So last time, our friend Amaka Anku from the Eurasia Group spoke about how climate change is affecting food systems and livelihoods in northern Nigeria, where herders are finding it harder and harder to maintain their cattle due to drought and desertification. And increasingly, those herders are driving their cattle further south in literal search of greener pastures. And that really does set the table nicely and bring us to today's topic: how climate change is changing livelihoods and contributing to migration. Last year, tens of millions of people around the world were displaced from their homes by floods, storms, droughts, wildfires, and other weather-related events. Many will return home to rebuild, but many will not. And just last week, the White House released a report on the impact of climate change on migration. That report called for a whole of government approach to addressing climate-fueled migration and, as we may discuss a little bit later, spelled out some potentially troubling implications for US national security. Today's excellent panelists will be providing us with a global to local perspective on how climate change is shaping migration and what it means for our Front Range communities. Dr. Valerie Mueller will begin by giving us a global perspective on climate-related migration before we hand the baton over to Dr. Rebecca Galemba, who's going to narrow the aperture a little bit to focus on the effects of climate change for migration from Central America to the United States. And then finally, Atim Otii, Esquire, since we're doing titles today, brings us back home to our community here in Denver to discuss the way that climate change is affecting migration to our fair city and what kinds of challenges and opportunities migrants face in their new communities. In doing so, we're going to touch on a host of subjects. How is climate change affecting livelihoods in developing countries? And what does it mean for migration patterns? Is climate change related to other drivers of migration, like political instability or crime? How are those who can't migrate adapting to climate change? And ultimately, what can we do about it right here at home along the Front Range? Lots of ground to cover, so without further ado, I will pass the baton over to Valerie. Valerie, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Colin. So most of the work that I've done is on climate change and internal migration. I know a lot of you might be interested in sort of cross-border movement, and Rebecca's going to talk more about that. But what's driving a lot of the migration patterns we see is the fact that, heat that's driven by climate change is going to affect the local economy. So there's a nice study done by Marshall Burke and other co-authors where they map what are the losses in GDP per capita globally. You can see that the red areas reflect negative implications on economic growth, and a lot of those are in the tropical areas. So how does migration fit into the story? There was a seminal piece by Norman Myers in 2002 where he predicted about 50 million environmental refugees would, take place in 2010. By 2010, journalists like Atkins were saying the first available evidence seems to show that the places identified by the UNP as most at risk of having climate refugees are not only losing people, they usually are among the fastest growing regions in the world. So that's not too surprising because as a social scientist, we model what factors induce people to move. And there's a lot of reasons why people choose not to move. They have strong attachments to place. In a lot of the low-income countries, they don't have well-defined property rights. So it's much more difficult for an entire household to leave their community because there aren't land markets. And so if you leave that community, you may not be able to get land to produce in the future. And so there are a lot of reasons why some people move and can't move. Another explanation could be liquidity constraints are a huge part of the story. If you want to send a household member to move, or if the entire household has to move, you need to finance that move. And typically when there's a climatic shock, people have less, not more money to finance something like that. So what is the current consensus of climate migration? Well, first, there is strong evidence that temperature fluctuations or heat stress, heat events influence mobility. And a lot of that is tied to farmers not being able to produce or their yields being affected during those periods of time. Now, one thing to keep in mind, even though there are positive associations between migration and climate, the absolute numbers predicted are quite small because in general, migration rates tend to be lower than people believe. Another thing that's discussed in this literature is that there are a lot of people that would like to move but can't. So sometimes because of things like liquidity constraints, people that would like to move can't adapt. There's other reasons why they can't adapt besides not having enough financial capital to finance the move. We also think about a lack of transferable skills. So for example, even in a small country, there are a bunch of languages that are spoken. And so if someone wants to move to the city, they need to be able to speak the national language if they want to move into, let's say, the service sector. And oftentimes there's not enough infrastructure for people to take advantage of those employment opportunities. So you can imagine, there aren't paved roads. There might not be a well-defined bus route to get to those cities, and that prevents people that would like to adapt. One thing I found in a paper with colleagues looking at East African countries, we found that actually during heat episodes, people in urban areas were actually less likely to move. And that's puzzling, right? It's puzzling because typically we think of rural households as being the ones that are vulnerable. In this particular case, the reason why we saw this is because there's a fraction of people in urban areas that take advantage of labor markets during harvesting times. So the wages are pretty high due to labor shortages. And so you even see people in the city migrating to the fields to work on a temporary basis. So you have to think about not only whether someone can move, whether they have the assets to move, but whether there's a place for them to move to or a job for them to move to. Beyond heat, there are some interesting patterns we're seeing with respect to sea level rise. So Joyce Chen and I, we actually wanted to look at the implications of sea level rise, and we focused on Bangladesh, where tidal flooding is actually making the water and the soil have higher salinity concentrations. And we found that contrary to the qualitative reports of people being displaced during flooding per se, riverine flooding typically, actually it's the soil concentrations that matter, because if you have freshwater flooding, it's actually better for the land. So people temporarily move to higher altitudes, but they go back to their fields. So it's a matter of delaying the agricultural cycle. But in the case of tidal flooding, where it actually adds salt to the soil, it becomes much more difficult to adapt. So what we saw was that farmers were actually losing revenue in rice production, and those that had assets were diversifying into aquaculture, because fish farming is much more tolerable to soil water salinity. And so we also tried to predict where people were going, and not surprisingly, based on the historical precedents of migration, people are generally going to move within the district. So we predicted that if the entire coastal area were to experience the most extreme salinity from the past, that approximately 140,000 people were going to move, but they were going to stay in those vulnerable coastal zones. Out of district migration was going to be a bit lower. We predicted about 58,000 people were moving to other locations, but still, most of them are moving to Dhaka and even Chittagong, still area that's vulnerable to sea level rise. So yes, migration is a form of adaptation, like our ancestors who might have migrated to escape the potato famine or the Dust Bowl. But we need to identify interventions in order to reduce the vulnerability to climate change and therefore distress migration. And some of those things, some of the interventions on the table are saline tolerant varieties, but there's also we're going to need international initiatives to help finance a more managed retreat, because not everyone's going to be able to stay in the places they live.
Wow, thank you, Valerie, so much for just giving us a wonderful kind of global perspective on this issue, taking us from East Africa to Bangladesh and beyond, and really helping us understand kind of the myriad different ways in which climate change is affecting agricultural livelihoods. It's not all operating through, say, drought and flooding. There are many, many other channels. So having just received this really nice broader kind of context, we are now going to turn to a little bit more place-based kind of analysis. And Dr. Rebecca Galemba is going to talk about climate change and its role in migration from Central America to the United States. Dr. Galemba, floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay.
Nope, Rebecca, we are seeing your desktop.
Oh, you're not seeing it. Okay, hold on one second. Sorry, I'm trying to get that on the wrong desktop. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, you want to go to
Okay.
full? Looks great.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what is going on in Central America and what has been happening. And really in 2019 was the fourth straight year in a row where non-Mexicans, outnumbered Mexicans, apprehended at the US border, which was a change in historical patterns where most migrants arriving at the US-Mexico border have been single, largely adult men from Mexico. By 2019, the largest country of origin became Guatemala. However, Mexico did overtake that role in 2020, and even just some recent data coming out from a colleague shows that actually arrivals of families from Honduras and Guatemala has actually plummeted this September, and that's a result of a variety of factors, including some of the expulsions that have been implemented under Title 42, which I can talk about in the Q&A. So why are people leaving and where are they coming from? And again, I think we need to look at migration within its larger context in Central America. So there's a history of immigration as an escape valve in Guatemala, how climate-induced vulnerabilities are interacting with issues such as violence, poverty, and insecurity, especially declines and backsliding in democracy in the region, specifically in Honduras after the 2009 coup, and even recently with Guatemala kicking out its Anti-Impunity Commission in 2019. Also, the region has long social, political, economic, and migratory ties to the United States, which scholars of migration note that climate is just one of 5 factors that influence migration, and often more indirectly in terms of the social, political, economic, and demographic factors. The region is subject to climate-induced vulnerability, but the links between climate and migration are not necessarily clear. oftentimes they're more indirect and direct, and in fact have many local variations as well. And so while some areas, for example, of Guatemala are getting drier, some are getting wetter, there's also some particular places where there's been little change at all. In Guatemala, the regions where people are mostly leaving from is its Western Highlands, where food security is also concentrated. And you can see this map in the corner, largely showing those areas and some predictions under COVID-19, which has intensified some of those challenges as a region that's largely rural, significant indigenous population, as well as low mobility. And 70% of Guatemala's poor and rural areas are reliant on agriculture. And so those effects are often most intensified in those particular areas. This is some data for a project I've been working on with colleagues, with including Stephanie Lutert, who was able to look at border apprehension data of family units from 2012 to 2018. And the map on one side is much more zoomed in compared to the other, but as you see, the kind of communities where have the highest apprehension rates of family units are largely concentrated in those Western Highland regions. Here again, you see the Department of Huehuetenango, which is in Guatemala's Western Highlands, again, where food insecurity is very highly concentrated, as constituting a steep rise in migration. Some of the other dynamics that are happening in what is often referred to as a dry corridor, and this map maps out the way that corresponds in Central America. And I think, again, we have the combination of both slower onset change as well as more rapid onset disasters. And the kinds of migration that might influence are different depending on those different circumstances, but largely what we've seen is contributing to food insecurity is longer dry periods. And so it's often called La canicula, which is a dry period, normally in the summer, rainy season, that's kind of a dry period in between, has gotten longer. And so there were 45 straight days of that in 2014, which led to dramatic losses of basic crops like beans and corn, in addition to droughts and floods in 2014 and 2016. Another impact is coffee rust. And these are regions very heavily dependent on coffee farming. And I think what's important to note is, where does climate fit into the reasons why people are leaving, and how do people perceive what's actually happening to their environments, and how might they interpret those causes and actually experience them as economic rather than climate related. And so many Guatemalans, for example, no longer can grow food, have relied on wage labor to purchase their food, many who have historically worked in the coffee economy. And due to the destruction of entire crops, lowering prices due to global competition, there largely aren't jobs in that sector either. And also prices have plummeted severely since 2015 as a result of both global price dynamics as well as rust from increasing warming. And I think more sudden things that have also aggravated the situation rather than necessarily a direct cause have been the region's vulnerability to natural disasters. And most recently, we had the devastating impacts of 2 hurricanes following closely on their heels in 2020, Eta and Iota in the region. And so kind of what can we learn from the nexus between climate and migration in Central America? And I'm glad that Valerie brought up some of these issues, that migration is a longstanding form of environmental adaptation, but just one among many forms of adaptation. And in fact, the links to migration are not necessarily clear-cut, nor are they deterministic, but we need a lot of local nuance of what's happening at the local levels, how people perceive those changes, who has the resources to move and when, as well as how it intersects with other social, economic, and political drivers and factors that influence migration decisions. And as Valerie mentioned as well, the environmentally displaced usually tend to move internally, short-term, nearby, and often to locations that are just as environmentally vulnerable. And the poorest and the most vulnerable are the least likely to be able to move, which makes it interesting to really think about some of the interventions around development. As we know in the short term, some development is actually likely to increase migration due to people actually having the resources to be able to move, but not enough to actually make a livelihood. We have less attention kind of in this narrative that assumes sometimes that climate change leads to migration, is they have less attention to those who stay, as well as the fact that many development initiatives that are posited to ameliorate conditions or address what are called root causes have also generated displacement and environmental damage. And in fact, development-induced displacement, which is largely internal, has been often seen as one of the largest forms of forced migration in the world. So I think we're going to take away three things: is to understand how climate vulnerability isn't necessarily a sole driving or causal factor, but how it interacts in specific places with political, economic, social, and demographic factors and influence migration. That there's a real risk, and this is something that we can address in the Q&A, of applying a crisis or security lens or threat narrative to the impacts that climate is often presumed to have on migration, and by extension on destabilization and conflict. And in many cases, the empirical evidence is not borne out, and we've kind of developed a system where migrants in turn are positioned as the threat, and can talk about how that's often counterproductive to both addressing climate change as well as dealing with migration. So I'll leave the rest to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's a little formal, but you can tell by the brickwork in the background that Rebecca is only about a floor and a half away from me here at the C complex at the Joseph Corbell School. Fantastic colleague, great remarks. And I think that one of the things I would just like to pull out of that and highlight, because I think we can return to it in the question and answer, is just the way that both Valerie and Rebecca's comments have highlighted the economic dimensions of migration and explanations for migration. And I think that that's important, especially in the context of climate change, because we know from survey research, in particular survey research conducted in sub-Saharan Africa, that migrants who are coming from deeply climate change and natural disaster affected contexts, and in some cases, contexts where there are active armed groups engaged in violence against the populations, when they are asked why they migrated or what drove their decision to migrate, even though there's all of that additional context around it, very few of them would say that they migrated because of violence or because of climate. Most of them will say that they migrated because of poor economic prospects and in search of better economic opportunities. And so I think that that's a great position from which to pivot to comments from Atim Otii about how climate-related migration and migration in general is affecting our communities here in Denver, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities for migrants and refugees who are winding up here along our Home in the Front Range. Atim, please.
Thank you, Colin. Again, my name is Atim Otii, and I'm the Director for the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. One might ask, what does such an office do? Our office really works to promote the well-being of immigrant and refugee communities, and we try to do that by advocating for inclusive and meaningful integration into our city. I think what is important to level set the conversation of, who is coming to our cities and where are they coming from and why, which are a lot of the remarks that some of the professors have been commenting on, are the differences between who is a migrant, who is an asylum seeker, who is a refugee, and who is an immigrant. I think there are, I just want to note that there's a lot of different processes and ways that individuals come to the United States through migration. And I wanted to just make sure that we are all a little bit clear about the different definitions. So, a migrant, as we've heard, is someone who might be moving from place to place within their home country or across borders. And for some reasons, it could be economical, political, or a combination of both. An asylum seeker, which I think we've heard a lot about in the news, is someone who, again, wants to seek international protection from dangers in their home country. A refugee is someone who is outside of the United States, has gone through a process to be determined to be a refugee, again, being forced to flee his or her home country because of war, violence, or some sort of persecution. And then the last definition that I wanted to just level set us is on an immigrant. And that immigrant could be someone who has made a decision to leave their home country and move to a foreign country with the intention of settling. And I think it's important to note that individuals might move from one definition to the other. So it's important to note that we don't necessarily, people don't necessarily stay a migrant. Another thing that I wanted to just talk about briefly was, what's been in the news is who's coming to the southern border and why individuals are coming to the southern border. What folks may not understand is under US immigration law, particularly for asylum protection, an individual has to actually come to a port of entry or a US land in order to seek that protection, unless they go through a refugee process, which is coordinated through the United Nations. And so the professor speaking before me, Professor Galemba, and a lot of the migrants that might be coming through Central America, while they may be migrants to a certain degree, there's also a sense of need for protections that may have started from one cause, but are other factors that are potentially making them asylum seekers, and eventually making them asylum seekers when they come to the US border. In terms of our national immigration system, I think it's also important to note that the systems are truly busting at the seams, both with increased immigration court backlogs and asylum backlogs. And I mention these things because I think it's important to note that as we talk about migration and we talk about who's coming to the United States, it's important to understand the mechanics or the institutions that work or involve individuals who are coming to our borders and seeking protection, international protections. In Denver alone, we have about 92,000 individuals that are in either detained or non-detained immigration court proceedings. And something that many folks may not know is Denver's immigration court was identified this summer by the Biden administration as a court that could assist individuals who are arriving at US borders in families with a dedicated docket to try to expeditiously get what are nationally about 16,000 cases through the immigration system. However, some challenges to that are really around due process and fairness in those proceedings. And then the only other thing that I'll say, just in terms of a national lens of migration and the institutions that interact with migration, is that the US government also has a form of protection that's called temporary protected status, that sometimes can be used to help nationals of countries that have been impacted by environmental disasters. So why do I mention all of this? Because these are all ways that individuals can come to communities like the Front Range, like Colorado. And when they come to cities throughout our state, one thing that my office does, and what the city of Denver has done by having an office like mine, is really looking at what are opportunities that offices like my own can really support the integration of the various types of individuals who come to the US from outside of the United States. And I think with climate change, one thing that has been noted at the federal level, but is also really being echoed at the local level, is that local institutions, municipalities, we really need to be informed and involved in the coordination because we are the ones who receive individuals who are either here to look for and be better connected to resources such as education for their families, but also employment opportunities that are both formal and informal in urban settings. I do think it's also important to note that, while we have resettlement agencies that are in the Denver metro area to assist refugees that come through a process that's in coordination with the United Nations, it's also important that cities have inclusive policies that truly try to incorporate and include migrant needs again, that are important to a city's ability to respond. And so, my office works to look at what are the needs of community members who are new to our city, and really try to plan and be responsive to some of those. And I think some of the bigger needs that we are seeing in the Denver, city and county of Denver are, how do we support individuals who are contributing to our economy? I think we've heard from folks who are migrating and who have come to the United States and are here working. But how do we make sure that if it's formal or informal, it's still, how do we support them? And I can talk a little bit in our Q&A about some of those kind of inclusive policies that the government, our local government has led. But, for example, if you think about essential workers due to the pandemic and how, essential workers were, kept on duty or had to really work through challenging times during the pandemic. Well, in Denver and many other cities across the country, a lot of those essential workers would identify as immigrant or individuals from different countries. And many of them were left out of federal forms of pandemic relief or state relief. And, that was a response, that was an impact that Denver saw. And so we wanted to respond to ensure that those who are in our city felt like they at least had some sort of opportunity, again, to be supported. And so we actually started what's called the Left Behind Worker Fund. And that's really just a policy example of ways of making decisions that really make sure that you are integrating and being responsive to all as much as you can of the individuals that reside in your city. Another area I think that has been really important is safety. Because of the national landscape around immigration, federal immigration enforcement, it's been really important for the city of Denver and other cities to really engage in how are we able to ensure that those that are living within our city limits are feel safe, and they feel safe reporting crimes. They feel safe accessing public services that are necessary for their family and for themselves. I think also access to public services and programs has been another area that the city and other cities that want to really engage in inclusive policies want to review, particularly around language access. Many individuals may not be, speak the language English that come to the United States, and how can they be supported with programming and access to public services. So I think I'll stop there, and I think I'll turn it back to Colin, but those are just some of the, I think, the ways that our city is working on, again, addressing some of those challenges that we see, but then also some of those opportunities. And I'll get into the more opportunities that I think the city has done during our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atim. Wonderful local perspective and a great preview of some of the subjects and issues I hope we'll be able to turn to in the Q&A. Speaking of the Q&A, I just want to remind everybody that the chat box is open, and please get your questions in. You've got an incredible diversity of expertise and lived experience here on this panel. We really want to make sure that you get the most out of the knowledge that is here. And I just wanted to add something to kind of to build off of Atim's and Rebecca's comments, which is that when we talk about who's coming here and who is a climate migrant, especially at the southern US border, our thoughts often gravitate to Central America, and that's for fairly obvious reasons. But it's worth mentioning too that increasingly in the last couple of years, we are actually seeing at the US-Mexico border the arrival of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, many of whom have taken an incredibly arduous journey, first coming from the continent of Africa, and whatever country that they're coming from, and transiting through Brazil or Colombia and up through Central America including crossing a piece of territory that's known as the Darien Gap. And for you geography buffs out there, you know that the Darien Gap is probably one of the most dangerous places for a human being to traverse under any circumstances. And so doing so as an undocumented migrant operating in a strange environment and often on foot, it just, I think, really underscores kind of the peril, but also the incredible sense of urgency that is driving people to be making these kinds of decisions. And so while we're here kind of talking a little bit about the migrant experience, and I guess we could expand that to talk about the refugee experience as well here in the United States, I think it might be easy for some to assume that once migrants have gotten away from a failed crop in Guatemala, or they've been able to flee kind of climate-fueled political instability in northern Nigeria, that perhaps they've made it now that they're in the United States. But migrants, as you've begun pointing out, Atim, faced a host of kind of challenges. And Rebecca, I know in some of your academic work, you focus on the specific challenge, which is the challenge of getting paid for the work that they have honestly done. And so I'd like to give both of you, maybe starting with Rebecca and then going back to Atim, an opportunity to kind of reflect on these challenges and in particular, what we can do to try and ameliorate some of those challenges.
Great. I'll touch briefly on that. And I think, a lot of the challenges that immigrants face in Colorado, as well as the United States more broadly, often have to do with the kinds and limited kinds of legal pathways and mechanisms we have for people to come here in the first place, whether it's seeking protection or whether it's seeking temporary work and then return back to their home countries. And in fact, sometimes we see that people are a little better off once they've gotten here if they don't have any means to protect their status. And in fact, as we've intensified enforcement of the US-Mexico border, what that has done is made it much harder for people to pursue the kinds of cyclical migrations like they may have had in the past, increasing the risks and costs of doing so, which often leads people to incur large debts to get here, or have to try to scrounge together multiple jobs and crowded living conditions here just to not even remit money home, but to justify the migratory sacrifice in the first place and to finance that journey, which they may have taken out various kinds of debt to finance. And so I've had a project that recently focuses on wage theft, which is a problem that doesn't just impact immigrants, but it is disproportionately concentrated, not just among immigrants, but also women, people of color, as well as mostly people who work in informal and non-standard work, which we know is an expanding part of the economy, but immigrants often, because of few other options, are concentrated there, at least for the short term, sometimes the long term when there's no means to adjust their status. And, US wage and hour laws, despite the guarantee the right to be paid for work that you complete. However, the catch-22 is that we have immigration laws that prevent unauthorized immigrants from working and employers are hiring them. What we see is the consequences are quite disproportionate, which incentivizes exploitation. There's actually a new memo coming out from the Biden administration, which is actually quite exciting, because as in the past, we've seen this work out in terms of immigrant raids, and for example, over 600 workers in the Mississippi poultry plants under the Trump administration. Meanwhile, we see only a handful of employers ever get prosecuted for often courting those workers in the first place. There's actually a new memo that just came out, which is interesting, that provides pretty unprecedented guidance, not only to more target employers to halt raids, as well as to amplify the kinds of protections that we could provide to people when they've suffered things like labor trafficking, as well as other forms of workplace exploitation.
Thank you, Professor. No, I mean, those are all very real consequences, and I think challenges. I would just add too on the point about access to public resources and protections. I know that the city of Denver most recently have been working with partners like yourself to really try to address the missing gap around protections for workers at a lower wage than just maybe some of the state protections. And I think that's another opportunity that the city has recognized is important and is responding because these are the residents that are in our city that should be protected. I think, one challenge that I'm hopeful we're coming out of was the public charge rule. And that was a very detrimental rule, and I think honestly still has impacts for a lot of mixed status families. So the public charge rule was something that essentially states if an individual is, some individuals without a certain type of immigration status are ineligible for federal funded programs. And some of these federal funded programs still had qualifications that many other family members were still eligible for. But because of the sheer fear and threatened kind of barrier towards pathways to citizenship or a permanent legal status, many families went without, offering or allowing their eligible family members to receive some of the public assistance programs. And some of these are food assistance, so food assistance, or it could have been medical assistance. And so you see this, if you will, ripple effect and the ripple impact of some of these challenges on the federal, but then down to the local level. I will say too that you've seen food pantries, not only for folks who are here with certain statuses, but I think just in general, because of that public charge rule, I think food pantries, particularly with the pandemic, have taken a very have been a very helpful resource to a lot of individuals who are very leery and very afraid of accessing public resources, again, because of that that public charge rule. And then I'd also say too, access to internet is something that I know that we have at the city, again, been working on, really trying to engage this digital or access to the internet, digital services for individuals, just to be able to connect with services that the city provides. But again, because of the pandemic, when everything shut down, we definitely saw that there was a lack of that access, just based purely on a lack of technology. And then just one other point that I'll make is the legal processes that Professor Galemba just mentioned. I think the legal processes are definitely a challenge that our city and other cities continue to face, particularly around those who have access to work and those systems that allow them to work, and you have to have a certain status to be able to work. But then also the machine, if you will, of the deportation immigration system that really separates families. And so one response that the city has done is to develop a legal services fund to really try to support individuals who find themselves in these systems, to really try to support the family as a unit to stay together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. With all of that said about the challenges that face migrants and refugees once they arrive in the United States, I think it's important to note, and Valerie, your presentation touched on this at length, that for every person who might want to migrate and is successful in migrating, there may be 2 or 3 more who would love to have those kind of opportunities and face those kinds of challenges, but are unable to do so. And you referred to these as trapped populations. So can you talk a little bit more, Valerie, about, who are these people? What kind of positions do they occupy in society, in the family? Are they potentially kind of disadvantaged in their local communities in ways that make it harder for them to access this important release valve for addressing climate-related pressure, but other pressures as well?
Yeah, so that's a really layered question. So I'm just gonna, that would be like an hour for me to answer that. But I think that the main point is that one of the things we're really exploring, going from a broader view, is that there's sort of a natural pattern between let's just talk about international migration rates first. There's Michael Clemens and Maripil Mandola, they basically have tried to just look at international migration rates and how that relates to the income of a country. And they're finding there's an inverted U shape. So basically, when countries are sort of moving from low to middle income, let's say, that's when you're going to see more migration. And then as countries become richer, you see less international migration. So going from there, it's very similar when you think about a household. So, most of the really poor households cannot afford to finance someone to move. And so we've seen some really interesting studies now looking at, well, what's the role of social protection? So social protection, when I'm talking about social protection, I typically think about cash transfers. First order effects, usually cash transfers. You give people cash in developing countries because you want to buffer them against, you want to make sure that they can maintain a minimum level of consumption, right? But a lot of us development economists are now looking at whether there's second order effects. And clearly we've seen that when people or households have access to that cash transfer, that there is a positive relationship association with having that cash transfer and international migration and internal migration. And even I've done a study in Zambia where I want to look at, does the response of migration rates vary depending on the exposure to climate? And what I saw that was when conditions are favorable for agriculture, that you see households using that cash transfer to engage in that labor market. But when conditions are not favorable for agriculture, then you see that households are more likely to retain their family members to help on the farm than to send them to potentially a job that doesn't exist, right? So you can't just think about the supply side, sort of the factors, the constraints on the household, but I keep saying you have to think about the constraints on the labor demand side. So are those employment opportunities going to be there for that person to migrate to?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yes, this is a really fascinating kind of discussion and subject, because I think that we, as a community of people who study this and who work in policy circles around this, we may be asking kind of, we're asking one of the important questions, but very rarely in these discussions do you really hear people taking seriously kind of the challenges they're facing, these kind of trapped populations. Because if I think about it just from kind of a lens of maybe say, I don't know, political stability or conflict, and this, I'm leading us in this direction because I have a very specific question about this to come. These are the populations that I guess I would say from my perspective, I'm more worried about. It is the populations who are facing truly desperate circumstances that are worsening because of climate change, but lack the adequate kind of resources to employ some of these adaptive strategies. And so thank you so much, Valerie, for walking us through some of the mechanisms and kind of getting at some of the kind of the policy implications and what we can do in terms of development programming. And development programming, we will be coming back to here in just a few minutes. It's a question that's hot on the minds of the people who are joining us in the webinar. As I said, I was kind of steering us towards this issue of the security implications of climate change and climate migration more specifically, because while Rebecca, you mentioned the Biden White House memo that's coming out that's kind of favorable with respect to these issues related to the differential treatment of employees and employers in terms of violations of employment law in the United States. There was also a report that came out last week on the impact of climate change and migration that largely frames this issue as climate-related migration as a national security issue for the United States. And this perspective is also evident in a just declassified national intelligence estimate. National intelligence estimate is a report that spans the entire intelligence community. What do we know and what do we think the risks are going to look like moving forward associated with topic X? And in this case, it was migration. And they categorized cross-border migration as having a very high risk of becoming a geopolitical flashpoint for conflict, not just in the United States, but at other international borders as well. Is the security lens, though, really the right one through which to be viewing kind of the topic of climate-related migration? Rebecca, maybe I'll start with you, and then Valerie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Great. So anyone who just came out of my class is going to hear a repeat because we actually just discussed this today. And I think, this is not new. We've seen this, coming out of, documents that are prevalent in the Department of Defense and the Pentagon for some years now, is this reframing of climate-induced vulnerability as a security threat, which I think is misleading and also misstates the links between migration, between conflict, and between climate. This idea that, climate inevitably leads to migration, which inevitably is conflict inducing, I think has been shown to be empirically suspect and problematic. But I also think, again, it feeds into our discourse of deflecting responsibility for climate change, deflecting responsibility for protecting people on the move, and funneling it through a deterrence logic that is furthering the ability to treat migrants as threats instead, and bolster the securitization and militarization of a threat, which does very little to address migration or the human rights of people on the move, or doesn't really do much to address vulnerability, whether that's giving people the kinds of capacities that would enable them to thrive at home, whether to move safely, and funnels, even, I think, bringing back the development conversation, funnels development through a deterrence lens, which is also quite problematic from both a migration perspective in terms of how that operates, from a climate mitigation perspective, as well as through a human rights perspective.
Valerie, thoughts?
Okay,
on
I'm gonna sort of take it from a different perspective than the human rights perspective. I'm gonna take it from a perspective where, and again, I'm a development economist and don't work as much in the United States, but just, we are a country that's facing serious labor shortages. We are a country that is facing an outright refusal to raise the minimum wage in some states. And we are a country that is facing declining fertility rates, which are going to reinforce the shortage of labor for work in the service, agricultural sectors, jobs that many of us and our children are not interested in performing over time. So as far as I'm concerned, I feel like we really need to think about, from an economic growth perspective, I think we need to think about sort of relaxing regulations on immigration rather than making them more strict. So I think there's a human rights reason to do this, and there's also an economic incentive to do this.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a broad agreement that an overly securitized lens may be inappropriate here. Atim, I'm curious on your thoughts on this subject.
I was just going to add to that. I think the notion that there are very few or little security processes for individuals that come into the United States is very misleading. Refugees go through almost 2 years of security vetting before they can, come to the United States. If an individual is seeking asylum and they are going through the immigration asylum process, you are vetted as well. So if you are applying for a visa to come to the United States as a temporary worker or just to visit, there are vetting processes that happen. So I think it's a misnomer to color the conversation of migration, that there is this very heightened security risk when there are actual processes in play that work to address that concern.
Thank you, Atim. I'll just offer just a couple of remarks running from my own perspective, because this is an area where I've done some research and an area where I'm pretty engaged with these kind of communities. And I think that one of the reasons why this discourse goes in this direction is obviously driven by kind of the larger political climate in the United States, where this issue has been made one that around which a huge chunk of the discourse, especially in the 2016 election, the 2020 election, but really previously, had revolved around this perception of migration as threat. And as somebody who has looked at the links between climate change, migration, and conflict pretty closely, I can say that, as Rebecca pointed out earlier, the evidence is not unambiguous that every time you see a climate-related event, like a flood, you are going to see migration, and that migration is going to be conflict enhancing. We often think of migration as being this kind of spark for conflict, but I think I would actually say that under most circumstances, it is kind of the release valve for kind of the pressures that would otherwise be there that might actually kind of spark these kind of conflicts. And I think that the other thing that is sort of good to keep in mind for as we think about the security discourse here is that climate change may be posing pretty significant threats to US national security. But it's not obvious that those threats are going to be coming in the form of large waves of migration or geopolitical tensions at the border. It's going to come, as we Coloradans know, right? It's going to come in the shape of forest fires as well. If we think about pandemic disease as a potential national security threat, in the last 2 years, we've seen over 700,000 Americans killed and many displaced by natural disasters and pandemic diseases. Those are a fundamental national security issue, but they don't necessarily fit into the normal lens that we bring to national security discussions, which largely operates through this idea that there is an enemy out there or there is a threat that is actor-based, and the policy around it needs to be built around deterring or neutralizing, right, that threat. And that's simply not the kind of risk that I think we're primarily facing from climate change. But I do want to use this as an opportunity because, Rebecca, you mentioned in the context of your comments this kind of idea of development as deterrence. And I think that that's a particular frame that you can bring to it. But I think that there are a lot of questions that have been coming up in the chat box about what is the United States government specifically doing, but what are other governments and international organizations doing to try and address some of the root causes and the root drivers of migration in the first place? Because if they would, if the idea is to not have to spend a lot of energy attempting to interdict these people or to deal with these populations when they arrive, the only really sustainable way of addressing that would be to resolve some of the underlying development, human rights, political issues in their home, in their home countries. So Rebecca, maybe I'll pitch it back to you to begin with that, but I'm curious everyone's perspective on that one, because that issue by itself, I think, has been the one that's come up most frequently in the chat.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think I'll bring it back to a little bit of the inverted view that Valerie discussed, right? In the short term, some development is likely to encourage migration, but then again, you have this U curve. But in many cases, the kinds of development assistance being offered are not necessarily sufficient, or really addressing the role of the global North in contributing to the unequal distribution of vulnerability and risk, often as a result of its own policies. And I think we've seen various kinds of aid packages that have been targeted towards Central America. And I think, you know what, I think we need to address the root cause. I think there's also a misunderstanding of what those root causes are and how to address them. And so, we see this proposal of $4 billion in aid going to Central America. And I think, that in and of itself isn't a good thing or a bad thing. My question is, who's getting that aid and where is it going to, and what are people doing with that? And I think, if it's going to groups on the ground already doing this work and institution building, we can say that maybe that'll improve things, but we've seen in the past large portions of that aid going to security assistance, often to corrupt governments with foreign policy concerns overriding actual rule of law concerns, which is concerning, as well as a large portion of money going to transnational, which are often called development projects. And those are things like dams, African palm, mines, which also contribute to displacement and environmental damage. And so I think it's important that when we look at these aid packages, to really look at what kinds of development is being offered, who it's for, who it's benefiting, and where it's going.
Thank you very much. Atim, would you like to chime in next, and then maybe Valerie?
I would just say that from a city lens, the conversation is really has been on an international level about how do cities engage in kind of coordination around migration. There are several compacts that have been developed and are being discussed. The Global Compact for refugees, but then there's also, it's escaping me, the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration. And I think these are conversations that are really trying to address what is happening and what technically can't be stopped per se, but how to assist each other globally to assist migrants either with inclusive policies for inclusion in communities, or resources to potentially resettle, or potentially allow an individual to cross that border into a different border. So I would just say that I think those are some conversations that I think are very helpful and I think are important to note, because it is the local, municipalities and the local entities, government entities, that are really seeing what migration impacts have on their communities.
Thank you for that. And we will definitely have an opportunity to return to that suite of issues a little bit later when we talk about what can our participants here do in their own communities? What can they do to help and address this suite of interrelated issues? Valerie, your thoughts on that topic? Sorry, the previous topic.
Okay, I'm hoping I'm following all the different chains of discussion, but I mean, my feeling is that, the United States gives a lot of aid towards development, and I don't see why we couldn't take some of that aid to better integrate migrants in our country, because the United States is going to need, as I'm saying before, we have a shortage of labor in certain industries. Either we're going to have to change the structure of our economy, or we're going to have to somehow tap into a labor force that can provide the jobs that we need for our current sectors. So I personally, I don't think that we can entirely I don't think we can, USAID still is going to have a job. I don't think I'm saying get rid of USAID. But as we know, the more money that we're giving to a low-income country, we're going to see more international migration. It's going to take a lot more investments than we're willing to give right now to get them to go from low to high income status. So I think we just need to be more realistic in our regulations and also in the resources that we give to be able to accommodate more migrants in the United States.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like there just aren't enough resources to really effectively deal with this particular suite of issues by trying to sort of reduce the demand side for migration in the developing world.
No, there's too many constraints. It's not just a matter of having financial capital. You have to shift social norms. I mean, there's a variety of things. Women aren't even in the labor force right now in some of the countries that we're talking about. And we know that women are major contributors to the economy. So there's just a lot that needs to be done before some of those countries are going to be middle income.
Mm-hmm. And I think that just another thing to add on this discussion, regardless of whether or not this is going to be, as you point out, USA will still have a job moving forward. What they can do is that they can begin integrating into their planning, sort of the principle of doing no harm, right? And so that this is something that actually has been implemented, I believe at this point, USA-wide, which is requiring climate impact assessments to be part of programming. So that if they are, say, working on an agricultural project in central Uganda, the way that that's being elaborated, they've already gone through and done the environmental impact assessment to make sure that that's not exacerbating either local environmental problems or contributing to climate change. So that is one way in which, even if this can't be the entire solution to the issue, it can be made to at least be doing no harm while we're attempting to promote development abroad, or the US government is, I should say. And that's actually a really good opportunity to pivot to an interesting question that leverages, I think, our lived experiences as people just as much as it does the expertise that you're bringing from your various kind of backgrounds and occupations. And that is really kind of an ethical one. What are the ethical responsibilities of the US, the participant asks, and I will actually expand that to talk more about the global north, which is the terminology that Rebecca used. What are the responsibilities of them to accept more, and they use the term climate refugees, but I think we could expand that aperture to include climate migrants as well, given the prominent role of the global north in contributing to the problem of climate change. Maybe let's start with Valerie on that one, and then we'll go to Rebecca and then Atim.
I mean, I think that's why there are a lot of these global initiatives in place. I mean, I'm not an expert on, political instability and refugee camps, but even at some point we saw Uganda taking a step forward and, taking initiative to host a lot of refugees in their country. And I think, internationally, those countries that have contributed to climate change through their emissions do have an ethical responsibility to host some of these migrants. Now, whether there's sort of a legal framework for doing that is uncertain, and I think that's what we're trying to move towards.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Sure. And I think, bringing it back to when Atim was talking about the Global Compact, I think the problem with that is the international norms that we have fundamentally operate in the interest of the countries that design them, and who get to opt out of them. And we know that the US didn't sign on, and whether it's legally binding. And then that keeps clashing against countries wanting to say the exception is to uphold their national sovereignty. So I think there's definitely reforms that are happening in a positive direction. I still think that it's let many countries of the global north to try to get themselves off the hook, both for managing migration and international protections and their rights under asylum laws, as well as responsibilities for climate change by pushing it and deflecting it elsewhere. And so, I do think that there's, an ethical responsibility. I'm not sure whether, refugees is the right framework, because we know the various mechanisms countries have used to get around accepting who then counts as a refugee and who is displaced. And we know that most of the global refugees in the world are hosted in the global south, right? They're not hosted in the global north. And so really thinking about ways that, yes, how can we, take more refugees and migrants, but also how can we give people protections that don't necessarily only adhere within the national borders of which they happen to reside in, right? So what kinds of protections or ways that we can reduce vulnerability that might be beneficial across the board in the long run, but are much more difficult political decisions in the short run.
Just really quickly to add onto that point, we've used this term climate refugee a couple of times here. It's important to note that the UN system is actually demurred from trying to any attempt to kind of define what would constitute a climate refugee, both because of the inherent complexity of the issue, but then as Rebecca was pointing out, because once you've defined the concept and there are people who fit into it, it creates a set of legal obligations for sovereign states and governments to meet. And so that's going to be, I think, a pretty fraught process. Atim.
I was just going to add the conversation around, what is the legal framework if there is this, we as a global community find that there is an ethical responsibility. And I think with the United Nations protections for refugees, that definition isn't in there. With our own US definition for, who is a refugee, climate is not there. You have to fit, into these 5 categories, and climate change isn't there. The other point that I think is important to note is because I think there is this ethical responsibility. I have been impressed, not just because I work for the city of Denver, but because I've seen what municipalities are doing with these different global compacts to start having conversation, because they recognize they are, they have a responsibility to address the needs of those who are in their communities. And if they don't address that, it becomes a problem. And so why not try to be responsive instead of reactive? So I'm encouraged by the conversations and the dialogue with local municipalities across the country and the world.
That's wonderful. And it's heartening to hear. Returning back to the cue from the questions from the audience, this one kind of relates to a concept that was raised earlier, the concept of managed retreat. And that's hopefully we'll get one of our experts to define that term for us here in a second. But it really relates to the fact that due to climate change, but potentially other factors, they're climate change related. I'd say sea level rise being one of the principal mechanisms by which this might operate. There's simply going to be places where traditional livelihoods are not possible to sustain, particularly in the agricultural sector. But indeed, in the case of many of the low-lying kind of river delta areas of the world, that it's simply going to be impossible to continue to live in these places. So when we talk about the concept of managed retreat, what do we mean by that, and what would it look like? Maybe Valerie, I'll go to you to begin with that.
Yeah, I mean, the United States, as far as I know from my colleagues, they do have some mechanisms for relocation of communities, such as, the Louisiana Delta, et cetera. So there are but typically we're talking about very small communities that are sort of, you know, applying to that particular program. In other places like Bangladesh, I mean, we're thinking of millions. Bangladesh has already started a sort of operating a managed retreat process. I don't know much about this, whether it's a success story or not, but I think one of the main, when we think about, you know, these types of programs, one of the main concerns we have is it's not enough to relocate an entire community. You need to provide them livelihoods. And should we be thinking about not only relocating their residences, but also, you know, vocational training and other things that integrate them economically? And so those are the types of programs I try to encourage and put on the table, especially, you know, in the place that I know most about, Bangladesh. They have a very successful manufacturing sector. And so there is an area where I feel you could transition some of people that initially worked in the agricultural sector. The problem is it ethical to tell people that they need to switch from a farming livelihood to an industrial livelihood? You know, there's a lot of utility that people get out of farming, and it's something that's been in their tradition, their family tradition for generations. And I think that's a more difficult issue to address.
Thank you. Rebecca or Atim, do you have thoughts on this issue of managed retreat? This idea of using policy levers at the level of national governments, potentially international coordination, in order to try to facilitate kind of an orderly movement in a planned fashion of communities out of areas that are being rendered kind of unlivable and unsustainable due to climate change.
I mean, the only thing that I'll say is, you know, in one of my previous roles at the Lutheran Family Services Rocky Mountains, the LFS had a very robust disaster response program. And so I think we saw that with Katrina and the resettlement of victims from Louisiana into, you know, our communities in Colorado. So I think there is a role to play, but I think to Professor Mueller, your point around making sure that there's livelihood infrastructure, that's a bigger question, but it's also a necessary question if integration is truly to be successful.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the concerns are also making sure who gets what. So working really effectively with people on the ground and with regional reintegration programs already in place, and to be careful that in some ways they could aggravate existing inequalities within communities, or to figure out why people are often relocated to areas just as vulnerable, or they might want to relocate back just as soon, of what also ties them to those areas, as well as I think we've seen some cases worldwide where this has been done in a more kind of accompanied by policing and militarism, right? And so I think we really have to be careful that to orderly and manage that we work effectively with regional based programs that are in tune with the challenges people facing and the opportunities that they need.
Thank you. And this really, all of those observations going to relate to, I guess, the next question I'll put on the table, because when we're talking about the movements of millions of people, and we're talking about, say, you know, for our economist friends, right, we're talking about, you know, like extremely valuable, like fixed assets in the form of land, infrastructure, and frankly, real estate holdings that are going to be rendered kind of I guess I would say valueless in the long term, right? These are all at this point kind of wasting kinds of assets. And so what that means is that there are going to have to be a lot of resources put on the table to address this. And so this gets to one of the questions that we got from our listeners, which is, do we see a type of Marshall Plan? They asked specifically about Central America, but we could think about expanding that around climate-related issues anytime soon. Are we going to see a big push, not just from the United States, but from other wealthy countries in a concerted fashion to adequately fund the immense costs of adaptation? That's a difficult question. So maybe, well, Valerie, if you want to jump in first.
I think it's a heated question because it's a loaded question, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of the property owners in coastal areas are wealthy. And should we be subsidizing wealthy property owners? If you think about lower income workers that live in coastal areas, they're probably renting. And so it's probably easier, their assets are more portable than wealthy property owners. So right now you could say a lot of the national policies are sort of subsidizing the wealthy. You know, flood insurance programs are subsidizing the wealthy. So the question is, should we continue to have these subsidies to the wealthy, knowing that they continue to invest and live in risky areas?
Yes, this is a point where I think that the analysis that operates from a position of economic efficiency and kind of the best leanings of social choice theory runs into the issues related to kind of political efficiency in terms of trying to move these things forward. But maybe Rebecca, can we go to you on that?
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic point and kind of troubling issue that you just brought out. And the thing is, of course, I would love to have faith, but I think maybe I'm a pessimist. And again, I was talking about the aid programs that have been already pitched towards Central America, is that they tend to attempt to address the issue without addressing the complicity or the privileges of the corporations and countries that benefit from the status quo, right? And so we're not going to have much movement if we don't question the kinds of sectors that we're otherwise investing in, or tax breaks for particular corporations, or the kinds of aid that we're promoting. Because at the end of the day, I think much aid is given as deterrence in some ways, not really as aid. I mean, we'd have to disencumber some of that aid, and that's really not the history of most aid that we've given, right? It's been about giving aid, but also in ways that boost the interests, right, of the United States. And I think, USAID, despite, wonderful programs that it has, it also fundamentally works in the interests of the United States. And so I think we have to think about some mechanisms that to take that into account.
Okay, thank you for that. I actually wanted to bring a comment from one of our viewers here into the discussion, because it pertains to this discussion we just had about managed retreat, which is that it's not exclusively geographical. This person's father's family in Iowa retreated from agriculture in the aftermath of the collapse of farm prices after the First World War and moved into the service industry in Iowa. This person points out people who did not retreat, especially from a real climate disaster like the Dust Bowl, which was alluded to earlier, Valerie, in your comments, suffered terribly for their refusal to retreat in a timely fashion. So we've been talking about retreat primarily through a lens of human mobility, but it also can be thought of in terms of redeploying kind of our assets and our investments in human capital and whatnot away from these types of activities that are going to be increasingly untenable, either because of the first order impacts of climate change, making certain types of agricultural practices simply unsustainable, or untenable because of the second order effects to try and mitigate climate change, right? So that there's going to have to be a pivot for many of our communities, and this is a fascinating topic in its own right, away from the production and processing of fossil fuels. But what will that transition to a just transition, so to speak, to a different energy future look like? Fascinating discussion. Maybe we'll be able to get around to that next time. We've got about 10 minutes left. Thank you all for sticking with us for this kind of really engaging conversation. And I'm so glad the panelists have been willing to indulge some difficult questions here, because this is certainly a heavily politicized issue, not just climate change, but migration as well. As we're beginning to wind down, I would like to pivot back to what it is that we can do as Coloradans or as residents of the broader Western United States. Valerie, I don't want you to feel left out over there in Arizona. What can we do in our communities to address the issues that climate migrants and climate refugees are facing in our communities, practically speaking? Atim, maybe I would start with you, because I think you mentioned kind of the role of food banks, for instance. I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on the ways people can get actively engaged in addressing this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, food banks is just one opportunity, right? So I think that there's a couple different ways. I think as a community member, one, being engaged in conversations like this and learning. I think we can hopefully all try to do a little bit more of that. The food pantries, to me, I feel like is a very tangible way to support individuals for a variety of reasons who are food insecure. The city and county of Denver has a very robust list. It's actually a map, and I can share that map where individuals can connect with the institutions that are supporting those food pantries to donate food. I know food is one of those, I think, needs that sometimes those who have don't think about just the drastic spaces that people are in who don't have food. And so we often forget, while people are maybe thinking about housing and transportation, oftentimes when individuals, low-income workers, individuals who have been laid off, food is something that folks go usually without to compensate for having to support other basic needs. I'd also say that in terms of some of the other opportunities that are available is really trying to be engaged on an advocacy level through school. So, there's a lot of, if you will, there's a lot of impacts that are not just with the individual who has traveled or who is new to the community, but to their families that they bring. And I think education is another avenue or intersect that, again, not a lot of individuals remember. The family members that are connected to the individual who might be in working is also equally important. So I think I'll maybe stop there in terms of some of those opportunities. I could go on.
Thank you. And we'll look forward to that map, and that will also be something that we can send along to the distribution list. So if you're watching and you're looking forward to seeing that coming, it will be forthcoming. Rebecca, maybe we can go to you next.
Much to add to that, except I think, just involvement in the kinds of policies and being in the community is that we've seen that local level can make a difference for people's livelihoods, both in terms of climate issues, though we know those go beyond our borders, but steps that we've had at the local level. And just the point with Colorado is that we had actually some of the most anti-immigrant laws in the country up until the mid 2000s, and then became one of the most welcoming after about 2013, 2014. And I think there's definitely things that can be done at the local level that improve the lives of immigrants, refugees, and migrants, as well as their integration within the community. And so I think that those are things that just keep into mind, is that those local policies also matter.
Valerie, anything to add?
I was just going to say that there are a lot of initiatives through, I know, religious organizations. My oldest kid, he goes to a Catholic high school, and they're going to the border and providing food and resources and things like that. So if anyone is sort of connected to a church or a temple or whatever, I'm sure that there are ways to get involved to help the migrants, particularly in Arizona, because we're so close to the border.
Thank you. Yes. So we have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to need to send it back to Kristen to wrap things up. So just one final question for all our panelists. We agreed we would ask this question of every panelist who participated in this series of events. So discussing, climate change related issues can often, I think, lead people to a fairly kind of doomy and gloomy kind of place because the challenge seems so daunting. Briefly, maybe in 1 minute each, what are you seeing in your work and your lives that give you hope?
I'll start. I think the conversations that are going on between offices such as mine and other like offices across the country and even globally from a local government perspective, as we are trying to coordinate and come up with solutions to assist migration. And then I'd say locally, because I am from Denver, I think community gardens has been a very thoughtful but also hopeful space around connection, not only because I work with integration and that is my office's main goal, but really to see how receiving communities, or those communities who migrants and refugees and immigrants find themselves, coming into communities as their neighbors, but to seeing that connection, particularly from a lot of communities where agriculture and connection to land was so important in that person's home country, and to seeing that connection as we, I think some of us see, cultivation with our hands and with our local environment be important.
Wonderful, thank you. Rebecca.
As I mentioned before, I was a little bit of a pessimist, but again, I have been impressed with some of the policy changes we've seen at the local level, especially even working with some attorney general's offices across the country that are now rethinking kind of who law enforcement serves, right, and ways to protect some of the most vulnerable, realizing that that impacts everybody. And I think also just seeing, we know that this kind of idea of deterring migrants and militarizing borders has spread globally. We've also seen on the flip side, I think the growth of, whether it's social movements, student activism, creating those kind of networks from below that also are attempting to push, right, in the policy sphere as well. And especially, I think some of our students who are now really thinking much more critically about these issues than, I ever did not very long ago.
Valerie, last word.
Yeah, I want to echo what Rebecca said. Basically, about 10 or 15 years ago, when I started working in migration, it was always seen as sort of a negative implication of economic development. And then I think now what we've done is convince donors and development agencies that migration is a pathway out of poverty. And so now we need to decide what type of resources do we need to develop solutions for healthy levels of migration.
Thank you all again so much for all that you've given us in terms of your knowledge and your experience, and for a really robust discussion. Kristen, back to you.
And thank you all of the guests. What a rich and conversation. I still got things swirling in my head, as I'm sure all of our guests do. Very grateful for your time today and for your expertise. So huge thank you for joining us. Huge thank you to our audience as well. As a reminder, we did record this, as we will all of our episodes. It's already available on YouTube. Nicole will be dropping the links here in the chat. We'll send that. We hopefully will have this back here on November 16th. Same place. So 12 to 1:30 p.m. Mountain Time for our final episode. We're going to bring it really local and talk about Colorado's food landscape. I hope you all take care and have a great rest of your day and kicking off your fall. So thank you very much for joining us.